What does it mean to be missional? Alan Hirsch is our guest this week, discussing how the church should organize itself around the mission of God. It's all in episode 59 of the Church Leaders Podcast.
Welcome to the Church Leaders Podcast, where we're helping you lead better every day. And now here's your host, podcasting from scenic Colorado Springs, Colorado, Andrew Hess.
Thanks for tuning in to episode 59 of the Church Leaders Podcast. I'm Andrew Hess, your host, and this week, our guest is Alan Hirsch. Alan is an Australian missiologist, author, and thought leader, and is the founder of several organizations, including 100 Movements, Forge Mission Training Network, and the Future Travelers. He's known for his innovative approach to mission, and he's widely considered to be one of the key mission strategists for the church in the Western world. And now, here's our conversation with Alan Hirsch.
Alan, it is so great to have you on the Church Leaders Podcast. Let me welcome you to the show.
My pleasure, Brian. So it's been good to be invited to be a part of it.
Fantastic. Now, are you podcasting from California right now? Is that where you're at?
Yeah, I live in Los Angeles, and I have been here for, 8 years. We came here thinking it would be about 5, and we've ended up being 8 years stuck in LA. It's not too terrible, but it's kind of, the weather's good today anyway.
And you're originally from Australia, right?
Yeah, actually originally from South Africa. I was born and raised in South Africa and left when I was about a 22-year-old, a young adult, and I've been an Australian, for the vast majority of my life and see myself as an Aussie.
No, that's awesome. Hey, let me set the course for our conversation a little bit, Alan. What I'd love to do is to really talk about what it looks like to be a missional leader and to lead a missional church. And many of our listeners are probably coming from a traditional background. And so I'd like to kind of make this a workshop on what it looks like to transition into something that's a little bit more missional. And so we're going to discuss the ins and outs of that, the philosophy and kind of culture behind that as well too. But just want to really dig deep into that together as we take time to share this with our leaders.
Right. Yeah. It's let's say it's a kind of a very complex process, but I'll try and break it down a little bit. It has been, it's predominated my own work for the last, at least 5 years, where I've been working with existing systems, and I put that as part denominational, but also with some larger churches as well as other churches, in helping them shift. So it's been a big part of my journey in the last 5 years or so.
Gotcha. So yeah, we might just scratch the surface in this discussion, but I'd love to get started and just ask you to describe, kind of in a nutshell, what a missional church or a missional movement looks like, and even within that, maybe some of the things that we often mistake for missional that are not. So if you could start there, that would be excellent.
Yeah. Okay, this is, the $100 million question. So what does it mean to be missional? For me, quite simply, it's allowing our participation in the mission of God in the world. That is, God's mission is prior to the church. That is, it exists in God himself. He sends the Son and the Father send the Spirit, and that sentness belongs to the doctrine of God. And the missional church is a church that focuses primarily, or allows the organization to be organized around the sentness of that it experiences from God. So that very practically, it's just our obligation to those outside of the church becomes a priority in terms of how we organize our functions of church. It doesn't dismiss the other functions, are all legitimate, like worship and community and discipleship, but it allows mission to inform all those things, so that they're actually geared towards participating in God's mission in the world. One, I just think so a lot of people say to me, oh, we're a missional church, and I say, why do you think that's the case? And they say, well, we do mission. So I say, okay, to explain that a little bit to me, and so what we do, we feed the poor on occasion, we've done the church plants, or we do evangelism. I said, all those things are great, but that doesn't make you missional. A missional church is one that allows the mission to determine everything. It's not just a department or a function of the church. It actually determines everything about the church, that is, its cultural expression. So if I could get geeky about it, I simply say this, is that Christology determines missiology, determines ecclesiology. And what I mean by that is that the person and work of Jesus, that he sets the tone and the definitions of what Christianity is on about, and it's very much defined on Jesus, determines our missiology, our function and our purpose in the world. And in turn, that shapes how we express our ecclesiology, that is our church, so that the church derives its kind of agenda or its cultural expression from its missionary obligations. Now, let me say it another way. someone said it that it's not so much that the church has a mission. That's what we normally say, that the church has a mission. Missional thinking says rather that the mission has a church. And mission produces the church, in a sense. It's God's mission that produces the church. And we participate in it. We don't invent it. Actually, it's very liberating, Brian, because most people think, oh, mission is an obligation that we have to do. But actually, God is already involved in the world. He is the missionary, and he's involved already, and we just have to join him. It's actually quite liberating, to be honest.
I think that's an excellent perspective, very unique for sure, but I think it's totally true that sometimes the church can take preeminence and we kind of forget that we're joining God on a mission, and it's not all about our specific church's mission. So it's fascinating to think about, and I'd love to unpack that a little bit more.
Absolutely. I would argue, Brian, in fact, this is one of the big criticisms that the missional movement has on the existing, the inherited forms which come out of the Christendom European expression, is that largely we took mission out of the equation very early. So, I mean, I've read Calvin from cover to cover and all that stuff, and his institutes. He mentions mission mainly as something you do among the Muslims, but he doesn't mention it anywhere else. In other words, most of his ecclesiology, most of his theology is actually articulated, and I'm using just an example, by the way, is articulated divorced of any real substantial commitment to the Missio Dei, that God is a missionary. And so it pretty much is bleached out of our codes and our understanding of ourselves. And this is, I think, to become a missional church, I know you're going to ask this somewhere along the line, because I suspect that's a good question. How does it happen? I would argue that until we actually grapple with the fact that mission is deeply embedded in the very fundamental purposes of the church, that is, the purposes of God expressing itself through the local community, and that is our duty and our joy and our obligation to allow that to form us in a significant manner, to change the way we behave. I would argue it's fundamentally a paradigm shift that needs to take place. And I think until one has that paradigm shift, we're never going to be able to become a missional church, because most of the ways we think about church are non-missional, and very deliberately so. It was scripted right out of the equation.
That's fascinating. I'd love to know, like, from the churches that are working with you and your different networks, like, what are some of the things that kind of help them click in their thinking, maybe a Damascus Road type experience that kind of change their thinking from an attractional philosophy to a very missional philosophy in church?
Okay, so again, paradigms are irritating things. I mean, because they're irritatingly conceptual, right? It's like no one's ever photographed one. They are. I mean, the world is. A paradigm works like this: is that the world is an incredibly complicated place. I mean, it's complex, right? And in order to negotiate our way through the world, we have to have a mental map of what is real, and this is done in groups, usually in societies, churches. Mostly it's done where people agree to say this is reality, and it's just the way things are. So the problem is with paradigms is because they're so intangible and so we assume that our paradigm is correct because we never really get to look at one, or we don't know who discovered water, but we know it wasn't the fish, right? So the paradigms are actually like culture. They're invisible and they're influencing us all the time. So the problem is by selecting a singular paradigm, you deselect other paradigms. Now think of me, and the audience can think of this. We've all seen that picture of the old woman, young woman thing, that paradigm thing. So when you look at it, and you might see at first an older woman looking at you, and then you blink, look hard and squint a bit, and then all of a sudden it's a younger woman in profile with a feather in her cap. And then you blink again, you see the old woman, blink again, the young woman. Here's the thing, is that by selecting one, you can't see the others. And that's the problem. That's why I say, like, a paradigm, you just have to be able to kind of articulate in a way that people get an aha experience. The other thing, bro, what I think is happening is that people are, I think the church as a whole is coming to the end of an era. I mean, Christendom as a phenomenon began to dissolve at the time of the French Revolution. That was, 200 and whatever years ago, where the secular society, or the idea of the de-churching, or taking the church out of the central, as being the central religious institution, and then beginning to push it further from the center as just one of the religious options around the place. So it's the secular culture. Europe is the example of this. I mean, like Europe has followed this even more consistently than the States. But the problem is that most of our thinking, most of our paradigm was set in that Christendom period. So most of our theology, most of our traditional thinking, the rationality, if you will, was developed in a time of profoundly non-missional. And that, of course, is the problem, is that, we assume that's correct, but we haven't really stopped to think about it. What we're experiencing in our days is that we feel that now what has got us to this point in history, we're in decline in every Western setting. The church is in systematic trend of decline. Current statistics in England say that on the current rate of the closure of churches and Christianity in England, that I think it's 2067 or something like that, say this will be the effective end of Christianity in Britain. And now, okay, people question stats and all that stuff, but there's no denying that there's a significant crisis. If you look into the future, it's hard to see what we're doing now as viable. And that's you never waste a crisis, bro. So I would say that we need to feel that very deeply and feel that the gospel itself is still as valid as it ever has been. But the church as a delivery system for the gospel, as the kind of the primary agency of the kingdom, that's what people have a problem with, and we need to change at that level. The missional ecclesiology, the missional church conversation is one about changing the church to fit the message.
Excellent. And that helps us understand it on a really kind of philosophical, historical perspective. Could you also give us a little bit of a picture of what the missional church looks like kind of in action today, maybe even in contrast to some of the traditional churches? What makes it distinct?
Okay, well, so the tractional church, again, it is assumed pretty much the paradigm is assumed from Christendom. That is, the assumption is that the church exists as part of culture, and people, they all understand that that's the religion of the culture, and so everyone streams towards that. If you went to find God in medieval Europe, you would just go to church. I mean, there weren't many other options around, but your assumption would be that the church was where you went to. And the thing is, what we call this, Ralph Winter used this kind of this spectrum of what he called cultural distance, and he used the word 0 to 4, and so you've got to think of it like as a continuum, a line, and every integer, every number indicates a significant barrier to the meaningful communication of the gospel, right? Now, most of the Christendom churches operated within M0, M1, and when you're not reaching beyond a cultural barrier, like language, worldview, religion, economics, big categories of culture, when you're not having to cross that. I mean, if I said, like, bro, if we had to learn what it meant to learn a new language to communicate meaningfully, well, hey, that's got a lot more complicated already, right? Now, everyone knows that. The problem is that most of our methodologies, most of our thinking is set within M0, M1. That's what I call outreach. No pun intended. That's called outreach, and also you might call it evangelism. That is, you're not crossing a cultural barrier. It's the low-hanging fruit, because you're not having to learn fundamentally different cultural things. You don't have to translate the message. Now that works, that's fine, but most of our churches are geared that way. So most of us, we reach out and we pull people back in, and that's all right within M01. That's problematic if you start reaching out beyond M1 to M2, M3, M4, because that's a whole lot more complicated. And the problem is that we are very undeveloped in our methodology. And incarnation is the way we say that we're the sent people of God, that the church, our obligation is to go to them, not to necessarily always expect them to come to us in our services, but actually go there and plant the gospel. And that's the key word we use. Because you don't plant a church, you plant the good news of Jesus story, and that the church begins to form itself around Jesus. It will look different, hopefully, because of the different cultural context. But we've got to learn how to plant the gospel again. And it's just so strange to us, because most of our codes, like I said, most of our theology is fundamentally non-missional. It's never really thought about this. It's just assumed that it's the central religious institution. Does that make sense?
Yes, that does make sense. And maybe you could also unpack for us kind of what it looks like for a ministry to reach that M3, M4 level. Maybe give us a couple examples of that.
Oh yeah, so okay, in a number of my books, there's a free one actually available on my website, alanhirsch.org. It's called Fast Forward to Mission, and to be honest, one of my most accessible briefings for mission in the West, right? So it's a freebie there, and I recommend, if anyone's interested, to check it out. I use this kind of category of M0 to M4. Traditionally was always used as cross-cultural mission overseas, and then begin to kind of give you categories of, let's say, in the West, you might find that, say, reaching out to a second-generation Muslim they are somewhat alienated from the church for a whole lot of reasons, and they might be M2. If they're first generation and they wear hijab, I suspect they're probably further down the track. But there are people like this in our settings. The Jewish people, I'm a Jewish kid, not a kid anymore, but I like to think of myself that way. Also somewhat alienated. Christian history has been very unkind to the Jews. And so, it's very, very hard to communicate the message to Jewish people. The homosexual community would be, again, far from us. But also just like, it doesn't have to be all complex groups like that. It could just simply be the local pub. And I mean, we've seen amazing ministries take place in pubs and sports clubs, nightclub. I mean, you name it. Acting groups. A worshiping community, a Jesus community, it doesn't need a building. It doesn't need the things that we think it needs. It just needs to have the Jesus story and then to learn how to have community around that. And the Bible gives us enough guidance on how that happens. We can do that in wonderful ways. It doesn't have to be always the same whole thing. Incarnational mission is the mother of innovation, in my opinion, because it demands, when you're taking the gospel onto brand new ground, into a new group of people, and you're trying to speak in words, in language that makes sense to them, well, you have to be innovative. You can't assume that what works here in the church setting that we used to is going to work over there. You have to be much more playful and innovative and entrepreneurial in trying to bring it out. So it's very good for us because it brings up that creativity thing.
Yeah, I love that. And thinking about that, you're working with a lot of megachurch leaders who are transitioning their thinking into more of a missional focus. Love to kind of just ask you to share a little bit about some of those leadership thoughts or other thoughts on leadership that are shifting within kind of the missional thinking in some of those larger churches you're working with.
Okay, so just to refer another book, I coming over to, you've mentioned like Shaping the Things to Come. That book, we wrote that very much as sorry?
Yes, love that book. I would totally recommend it.
Thank you, bro. That's and it was a book that kind of landed at a critical time, and it named a conversation. It was, whatever, God is good. But the thing is that when that was written, as you've read it, so it's like it's written it's not polemical, but it's kind of a challenge to the existing system. And it's written. I was leading a denomination at the time, as well as a local church. I was a senior pastor in a local church. And the combination of those roles, and I began to realize this is Australia. It's a very, very secular culture, more like Europe for Americans. Very hard work, and began to see, that our fundamental model, our way of being the church that we've just so practiced in, just wasn't going to work. And there had to be some sort of way of thinking. So I would say the critical part for this was that the leader has to experience that paradigm shift, I think, to be able to see that we actually stand in a completely different time and place, and also begin to kind of give permission, I think, to experiment outside of the out of the box. But I do think I often think of leaders as keys, right? Like if you think of a metaphor of a key opens the door, closes the door, and I think leaders are the guardians of the keys or the paradigm of the organization or the church, and it's fundamental that the leaders submit themselves to a learning journey. If it doesn't happen in the hearts and minds of leaders, it's hard to imagine how any local church can ever get there. And that's why the leadership conversation is absolutely critical. And they have to feel the challenge of our times and feel the challenge of the decline of the church as a whole, not just theirs. I mean, they could be relatively successful, but in the grand scheme, we've got more mega churches in America now than ever before. We've got less Christians in America than ever before. Just do the math. In other words, more of the same is not going to get different results, not fundamentally. We have to find other ways. And it's both and, right? And that's one of the big challenges, I think, that leaders have got to think in terms of both and, not either or. Keep doing what you're doing, but begin to experiment in the various fringes of your culture, or of the church. There are things that are happening on the edges there that are really wonderful opportunities to be able to learn how to engage in sports teams, or, just having a barbecue, and a beer and a Bible and get over it. Learn how to engage with non-Christian people on their terms.
I think that's critical, learning how to engage non-Christians on their terms instead of inviting them to us. And I think it definitely proves that the attractional church model has a ceiling.
It does. And one of the, again, another free book. So I'm selling books at the moment. Another freebie on the exponential side is a book I wrote called Disciplism. The fundamental basis behind is that we read the fundament, that the way we do evangelism is damaging our capacity to make disciples. It's a challenge I put out there. The reason why I say that is because we tend to read the Great Commission as an evangelism. So if someone says, "Oh, we're a Great Commission church," and you say, "What do you mean by that?" "Oh, we do evangelism." I say, "Okay, let's read the Great Commission together." And Jesus is risen from the dead. They're worshiping him there. It's a pretty awesome kind of experience. He's just about to ascend to heaven. And he commissions them. He says, "Go therefore and make disciples of the nations, teaching them to" what? "Obey all that I've commanded you. Baptize them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. And I've got your backs. I'm with you. Sign the check. I sign it with you. So go. Off you go." Now, I say, where do you see evangelism there? Exactly. So it's a bit of a shock because, most people never stop to think about that. But I think if we started by actually discipling non-Christian people, and if that sounds such a shock to most listeners, I say, look at Jesus. When exactly do we think that those disciples were born again? Anyone want to say in the beginning of their journey? No. Right? Middle? No. End? Maybe not. Like Peter gets rebuked by Jesus after confessing him as the Messiah, and he sets his face to Jerusalem. He needs to go to the cross, and Peter rebukes him, and he doesn't understand the cross. Now, we evangelicals say, if you don't understand the cross, dude, you're not a Christian. So Peter's not a full believer then. He's a disciple who's following. He's a pre-conversion disciple. Now, when does it happen? Don't know. Probably not. I suspect it between what they call the Johannine Pentecost, when Jesus breathes on them and they receive the Spirit, or Pentecost, or somewhere around there. But Jesus was with a whole lot of disciples who were not yet fully converted. Now, if we began to deal with our neighbors like that, and just to say, start investing in them. It's not just about giving them the four spiritual laws, as if you have no obligation to them before or afterwards. Start discipling them and teaching them the ways, teach them to obey. This is consistent with the early church catechisms. They were long-term pre-evangelistic tools to bring people to Christ. It's very effective. And we need to rediscover that again, I think. That's at least one of the things.
No, I think that's powerful. And I think you've often said that evangelism is something that happens on the path of missions. And I think that's really important as we think about how we relate to the world, how we go into these different parts of culture, and how important it is for us to kind of get outside of our typical zones within church and evangelism to dig deeper and further.
Yeah, so when you disciple, it's not just passing information on, you're actually forming people, and it's a way, it's an ethos. It's good for the discipler as well, because it actually sets you up as a model. And by the way, I would argue that one of the key factors in missional movement, and this is a very exciting part of the missional church movement, is a recovery of the discipleship as fundamental, non-negotiable aspect of what it means to be a church. So we're not just about entertaining believers. We're not just creating people who admire Jesus. We want to create people that follow Jesus, right? Not just admirers. And, and that we need to prioritize this. The odd thing I would say is that I say this is a strong statement, but I think from my experience anyway, that most people have no notion of what discipleship is. They think it's something like a 12-week doctrine course, somewhere along the way. And it's optional, really. You don't really have to do that, but you should become a member of the church, And that's not discipleship. And we don't even have a clear idea of it, let alone a process to make sure that people, if we're not clear about it, how can we disciple people? It's the most fuzzy thing. We've got a whole lot of things we do, which is weird stuff, We don't know where they come from. We still perpetuate them. We don't know how to disciple people. I was thinking something's wrong here. And I think, like I said, one of the big recalibrations is the disciple making and discipleship kind of process.
Excellent. Hey, Alan, thank you so much for the time you've spent with us. We're going to point our readers to your website and some of your resources as well in the show notes. And want to encourage any of our listeners out there, whether you're in a rural context, urban context, small church, big church, there are a lot of things that really need to be studied within the missional movement and that can be applied directly to your church as well to further the ministry and the mission of Christ. So thanks again, Alan, for spending your time with us, and take care.
Well, thanks again to Alan Hirsch for joining us this week as our special guest on the Church Leaders Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, it really helps us if you take a few minutes to subscribe, rate, and review us on iTunes, and consider sending this episode to someone you know who might benefit by listening to it. Also, you can always download the show notes for each episode at ChurchLeaders.com/podcast. In the show notes, we always include resources mentioned in the show and links to some of our guest top content on ChurchLeaders.com. As always, if you have ideas for how we can improve the show or guests you'd love to hear us talk to, you can email us at podcast@ChurchLeaders.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again next week.
You've been listening to the Church Leaders Podcast. For articles, videos, and free resources that will help you lead better every day, visit our website, ChurchLeaders.com. Thanks for listening.